Hello, and welcome to History Intersects today, where we inform modern policies with the past. I'm Andrew Kuiper.
And I'm Adam Bonomo. Andrew, do you know what really gets me fired up? Being a part of the blood that pumps through this country's heart. I'm talking about the voting process.
Me too, Adam, me too. Our country was founded on the right to vote. In fact, among the first thing European settlers did in this country was hold elections. But voting processes varied greatly from colony to colony.
You're right, and this disorganization would continue until 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And now this is especially clear in George Washington's 1789 election, when only 6% of the population were permitted to vote.
Permitted to vote?
Yes, permitted to vote.
So much for being founded on democracy, huh? The United States actually has a long history of people needing to fight for their right to vote, which we broke up into three periods. Before the 15th Amendment, which passed in 1869, after the 15th Amendment, and during the Civil Rights era of the 1950s and 60s.
So I know what you're thinking. What's the 15th Amendment? The 15th Amendment made it so that all males, regardless of race, color, or previous conditions of service, were given the right to vote. Before the 15th Amendment, it was illegal for people of color to vote. This is a blatant representation of voter suppression.
Exactly. And after its passage, individual states had to get crafty in the way that they kept poor folk and people of color from casting a ballot. Mostly southern states began passing poll taxes, requiring literacy and religious tests, and, the most egregious of all, implementing grandfather clauses.
Grandfather clauses? You mean the law that says that if a citizen's grandfather wasn't allowed to vote, they themselves weren't allowed to exercise it either?
You're exactly right. It first became law in Louisiana in 1896 and was picked up by 6 other states until the policy was struck down as unconstitutional in the 1915 case Ginn versus United States.
The problem with these types of laws isn't that they just suppress voters, but that they disproportionately affect poor and minority groups. And this isn't to say anything about women, who aren't even able to cast their first ballot until the suffragette movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920.
And, Adam, none of this is enough. With the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960, African Americans were granted the ability to take legal action against the governments that were infringing upon their rights to vote.
1964 and 1965 were huge years for voting rights. The 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes nationwide. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination based on race, gender, nationality, or religion. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became law, making it so that race-based discriminatory election practices were now illegal.
All this action was capstoned in 1971 with the passage of the 26th Amendment, which set the voting age to 18 nationally. Today, some see parallels between historic voter suppression and modern voter ID laws. About 34 states have some level of requirement that voters show identification at the polls in order to cast a ballot. This is a voter ID law.
Now, we know on a grand scale that voter ID laws pale in comparison to the oppression voters faced beforehand. But they are a source of conflict in the modern political landscape, especially given the controversies in New York, Nevada, and Los Angeles this election season.
So, why do we have voter ID laws? Proponents of the policies say increasing requirements cuts down on in-person voter fraud and gives a sense of security to the public about the voting process. Most states allow those without an ID at the polls to cast a provisional ballot, given that they return to the election office within a few days with the required identification.
But not all people see these as fair requirements. Opponents often see this as an issue because voter fraud is virtually non-existent. Research by Loyola Law School professor Justin Levet found only 31 credible incidents of voter impersonation in an investigation of over 1 billion. So that's 0.0000031% of the time.
Former Attorney General Eric Holder even compared these laws to the poll taxes of the Jim Crow South and their negative impact on minority communities.
Are we talking about the same Jim Crow South?
Unfortunately, yes. A working paper by researchers at the University of California, San Diego found that states with strict voter ID laws saw a significant decrease in turnout among minority and immigrant voters, and an increase in the participation gap between white and non-white voters. People in these suppressed demographics often vote Democratic.
In a two-party system, that doesn't seem quite fair.
Especially given the incredibly low voter turnout in 2012.
A report by the Bipartisan Policy Center showed that the turnout in 2012 was 57.5%.
And that's down from 62.3% in 2008.
Compare that to a culturally similar Australia, which has the highest voter turnout in the world at 95%. They don't have voter ID laws, and they fall under a different voting system called compulsory voting.
Compulsory voting in Australia is a system that obliges citizens to vote in elections. If an eligible voter doesn't attend a polling place or participate in an election, they can face penalties like fines or community service.
It's important to note that compulsory voting is supported by 3/4 of those polled in Australia and has shown no benefit in one major party over another.
Now, efforts are taking place to up the turnout in several states around America. Oregon is the leading example with their motor voter law.
We spoke to Henry Kramer, the program director with the Oregon Bust Project, a grassroots bipartisan organizing collaborative that led the charge of the motor voter law.
Henry, why don't you tell us a little about what's going on in Oregon?
Anybody who goes to the DMV to get a driver's license or a learner's permit or an ID card and provides proof of citizenship, which is required to get an ID card or a driver's license in Oregon and in many states due to a federal reform called Real ID. If they provide proof of citizenship and are otherwise eligible voters, and they give their information, their contact info, there's a record of their signature, that information is simply transferred to the Secretary of State, and those folks are registered automatically. They then, a couple of weeks after that, will get a postcard in the mail saying, you've been registered to vote. Do you want to opt out of registration or choose a member of a party so you can vote in primaries? And folks can either opt out and send that card back, choose a member of a party or send that card back, or do nothing and be registered as a non-affiliated voter. And so that's automatic voter registration in Oregon. That's how it works. And that policy is now spread to 5 and about to be 6 states. And it's looking like about 20% of America is going to be living in automatic voter registration states this year, which is incredible to think back 7 years ago when not only was this a crazy idea in Oregon, but most people across the country hadn't even heard of it.
Wow, that's great work they're doing for democracy out there.
You're absolutely right. If we're concerned about our voter turnout, America needs to start heading into this direction.
Now that we see the success of automatic voter registration, it's only a matter of time before we see it nationwide. All right, folks, I'm Andrew Kuiper.
And I'm Adam Bonomo, and that's what happens when history intersects today.